records of the year, the world's leading vocal group, the Beatles.
The show is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, here are the Beatles singing I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Now for our show, ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles.
The Beatles on Ed Sullivan. That was a night that changed music history. And what if I told you all of it almost never happened? Get ready to uncover the surprising twists and turns that nearly derailed their iconic debut, and discover how one fan's unwavering passion helped launch a musical revolution. They were just a few school friends who liked to play music together in dusty clubs, dreaming of reaching a global audience. Suddenly, they were on the cusp of primetime US television. It was a dream. It was about to become reality. They were also about to change the world. What no one knew, though, is that a 15-year-old girl named Marcia Albert held the key to unlocking their American dream. Her unbelievable story sparked a chain reaction that would echo through generations. Sit back and maybe grab the tissues, because this is a heartwarming and heart-wrenching tale of Ed Sullivan and how one girl's belief changed the world. February 9th, 1964. America was on the brink of a cultural revolution, and this British invasion was in full swing. The four lads from Liverpool were about to become the soundtrack of a generation. But before the screams, the tears, and the iconic mop tops, there was a 15-year-old girl named Marcia Albert, whose unwavering love for the Beatles set off a chain reaction that would change the course of music history. Just imagine being the one person in your group of friends that liked or had even ever heard of the Beatles. Well, that was Marcia. She was true American fan number one. When they finally did greet America on Ed Sullivan's show, it allowed the Beatles to occupy all 5 of the top 5 positions on the Billboard charts. That is a feat that has never been matched or duplicated by anyone before or since. And it all started with a chance encounter at Heathrow Airport. Ed Sullivan was so intrigued by this frenzy surrounding the 4 young musicians, he asked, "Who the hell are the Beatles?" This question would lead to a roller coaster of negotiations, near misses, and ultimately a night that would change America forever. And booking the Beatles wasn't easy. Their manager, Brian Epstein, was a shrewd negotiator who demanded top billing and a hefty paycheck for his boys. Ed Sullivan balked at the price, but deep down, he knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Already at this point, Ed could see that the Beatles were more than just a band. They were a cultural force. They were a symbol of youthful energy and rebellion, and just like they had with Marcia, Ed Sullivan, with his finger on the pulse of America, had sensed their potential to ignite a fire in the hearts of millions. Now, you know, there's this whole myth that Ed saw them at the airport and immediately wanted to book them on his show, but it wasn't quite like that. Sure, he was intrigued by their buzz, but to him, they were just 4 floppy-haired regular English guys. With the show being so popular, they had scouters, Peter Pritchard and Jack Babb, and they were tasked with sourcing the talent. On one of their summer discoveries, Peter got talking to Brian Epstein, and he took Jack to see the band play sometime in 1963. Now, the Beatles were starting to get really big in England, but no one really thought they'd make much of a splash in America. British bands just didn't have much of a track record over here at that time. But Marcia Albert, she sensed that special thing about the Beatles. She saw in them the same passion and drive that had carried them from the small stages of Liverpool and those sweaty cavern clubs with sawdust on the ground to the brink of international stardom. But little did Marcia Albert know that her love for the Beatles would set off this chain reaction, and it would soon involve high-stakes negotiations, and it would nearly derail their American debut. So how did her simple request lead to a legendary performance that almost didn't happen? Well, a few months later, the Beatles did this huge important TV show in London. It was called Val Purnell's Sunday Night at the London Palladium. Now, it was like their version of Ed Sullivan, and they just blew the roof off the whole place. Over 15 million people watched it. Now, that is a huge number for UK's small population. And of course, the press went crazy. They're the ones who originally coined the term Beatlemania. So now, Peter Pritchard is on the phone to Ed Sullivan saying, you gotta book these guys. And he played up the whole long-haired boys playing for the Queen angle, and that was enough to get Ed interested. So Ed figured if they were good enough to play for the Queen, they might be good enough for his show. So meanwhile, Brian Epstein had flown to New York to see if he could drum up some interest in the Beatles in the States. Now he knew that getting them on Ed Sullivan could be the game changer, could change their entire lives. So he met with Ed face to face and they started hashing out a deal. Only Brian knew that he wasn't going to take any old deal for his boys. They had become so close-knit, it was as if they were a family together. He wanted the best for them, and he wasn't going to budge. And his stubbornness actually threatened to send the Beatles' debut to superstardom crashing to a screeching halt. And it almost led to them being axed from the entire show. The Ed Sullivan Show was a Sunday night ritual for American families, and it was where you saw the biggest stars, the hottest acts, the most wholesome entertainment. But in 1964, Ed Sullivan was about to take this risk that would transform his show into a cultural phenomenon, one that would connect the generations. But let's go behind the scenes of the Ed Sullivan Show, where Brian and Ed were yo-yoing back and forth trying to negotiate a deal to get the boys on the show, and things got dizzy. Money was a huge sticking point, even though Ed would sometimes pay up to $10,000 for one single act. He initially offered Brian only $3,500 per show. Now that was peanuts compared to what they were used to back in England, but Brian was such a smart guy, he knew that getting the Beatles on American television would be the turning point for the band. And it is amazing to think how many bands were actually trying to pay Ed to be on the show. So Brian knew the draw of these four regular guys that had suddenly struck rock alchemy, and so he played hardball. He told Ed that he would take the lower fee, but there was a catch. In return, the Beatles would get top billing. Now this was actually a gigantic ask and a huge risk. That spot was normally reserved for the music elite, such as the swing king himself, Elvis Presley. So putting four virtually unknown British lads above household names across the country, that was simply unheard of, and they called Brian crazy. But Brian refused to budge on this. Brian was already such a pro who knew what risks needed taking for his now close friends, that they were already a close-knit group and family at this point, and Brian would not back down for them. Here he was trying to take this band to a whole new country, and he's making demands left and right. But just like Marcia, he saw how special the Beatles were, and he fought for them.
What do you think about the criticism that you are a bad influence?
I don't know, I don't feel like a bad influence, do you?
Nah, I think you're a good influence, Paul.
Thank you, John.
I believed in the Beatles when no one else did.
This unfaltering belief in the Beatles meant he would take risks to make them successful. This must have been contagious, as Ed saw something special in them too and finally gave in on the top billing. But of course, he did hedge his bets. He didn't give them top billing in the second show in Miami. He probably didn't want to put all his eggs in one basket. Still, it was such a big coup for Brian and the Beatles. Ed Sullivan was the biggest show, not just in America, in the world. To get on there, even for just $3,500 and not always in the top spot, it could make or break a band in those days. But it almost broke the Beatles before they even performed. That's right. After all this, it almost didn't happen again, all because of one man and a wobble. After they made the deal, Ed's son-in-law, Bob Precht, who was the producer, started having second thoughts. It's not surprising, as here was this group of virtual nobodies who spoke with a funny twang, and they're going to put them on primetime? He called Ed very concerned, but Ed told him to relax. He had a really good feeling about these guys from Liverpool.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you.
Good thing he listened to that feeling, huh? Because we all know what happens next. The Beatles go on Ed Sullivan and bam, Beatlemania, and it explodes. Suddenly, they're the biggest thing since sliced bread, and it all started with Brian Epstein sticking to his guns in those negotiations for his friends. Have you ever been in a situation where you stuck your ground and it turned out for the best? It just goes to show that sometimes in any business, you gotta be willing to take that risk. And Brian did that for his friends, and it paid off big time. Of course, he had a little help from a certain teenage girl who called her local radio station. And that's a whole nother story. So how exactly did a 15-year-old girl help create Beatlemania? Well, her name is Marcia Albert, a normal girl from Silver Spring, Maryland, who just so happened to be crazy about the floppy-haired four-piece. On a regular morning, Marcia was watching CBS News and up popped the Beatles. Marcia was so captivated by their soulful voices and their catchy melodies, and she couldn't understand how so few people in America had ever even heard of them. Hearing it once was enough to turn Marcia into a Beatles superfan for life. And who else here is in the same boat? And she went out and bought as many records of theirs as she could get her hands on. Only this turned out to be so challenging because barely anywhere seemed to stock them. She could not believe that a group that had suddenly gave her so much energy and so much inspiration could not be found anywhere in America. She really needed to change this, so she sat down and wrote a letter to her local radio station, WWDC, and it went something like, "Why can't we have music like this here in America?" Can you believe that? Marcia's letter wasn't just a request for a song, it was a testament to the power of music to connect people across oceans and cultures. Her words finally gave voice to the yearnings of a generation and would set in motion a chain of events that would change music history.
I wrote that I thought they would be really popular here, and if Carol could get one of their records, that would really be great.
Her words were filled with youthful passion and an unwavering belief, and it struck a chord with Carol. He saw in Marcia a reflection of the millions of teenagers yearning for something new, something exciting, something that would finally speak to their souls. So intrigued by this heartfelt letter that cited the next big thing, Carol James does some digging and manages to track down a copy of I Wanna Hold Your Hand from his friend who happened to be a British Airways flight attendant. Can you imagine that that was the extent a person had to go through at that time just to listen to the Beatles? This was no small feat. It wasn't in the US at that time at all, but for how it made Marcia feel, he played it on the show. That must have been some letter. To get a radio DJ to go on a scavenger hunt for a record from some virtually unknown band. But on December 17th, 1963, Carol James goes on the air and gets Marcia to introduce the Beatles song, I Want to Hold Your Hand.
Ladies and gentlemen, here are the Beatles singing I Want to Hold Your Hand.
And the phone lines light up instantly, and people are going crazy. They really couldn't get enough, so he played it again and again. In fact, he played it about 15 times in a row. It drew people together over that radio station, with the cars with their windows rolled down, and it suddenly was in every neighborhood in the city that week. It was like nothing anyone had ever heard before. Word spread like wildfire, and other stations started picking it up. All of a sudden, this song that wasn't even supposed to be out is being played all over the place, igniting the entire world. People are calling, requesting it every single day, every hour. It got so big, so fast, Capitol Records had to rush release the single ahead of schedule just to keep up with the demand. And boy, did it sell when it finally got here. It shot straight to #1 on the charts. The next day, everyone in America knew who the Beatles were. All because of that one 15-year-old girl and her meaningful letter. Isn't it amazing to see the American introduction of the Beatles? It proves the power of connecting people through music. America first discovered the dynamic four-piece because of one teenage girl deciding to tune in to the morning news while tucking into her cereal. The Beatles were already big in England, but they were just starting to get some traction in the States. And then this happens, and it's like throwing gasoline on a fire. Beatlemania explodes overnight. Not Brian Epstein, not Ed Sullivan, not Lennon, McCartney, or anybody. Nobody. It just goes to show that sometimes it's the little things, it's the unexpected things, it's the unexpected people that can make all the difference. So a few weeks later, when the Beatles finally did make it onto the Ed Sullivan show, they already had a #1 hit under their belts. They were riding high on this wave of popularity that Marcia Albert helped create. It's pretty amazing when you think about it, isn't it? But even after that, the road to the Ed Sullivan show was anything but smooth. What unexpected twist nearly derailed their big debut just weeks before it was about to happen? One huge twist was when Jack Parr tried to upstage Ed Sullivan by airing some Beatles material on his show. Boy, did that ruffle some feathers all the way up to the CEO. The whole Jack Parr thing was a real kick in the teeth for Ed Sullivan. Parr had this talk show and it was a rival to Ed's show. And only a couple of weeks before the Beatles were about to make their big debut on Ed Sullivan, Jack Parr hears of this and gets his hands on some footage of the Beatles and decides to put it on his show. Ed went nuts when he found out. I mean, here he was thinking he has this big exclusive, taking this huge risk. The first time the Beatles were going to be on American television, and he does it only for $3,500. And now Parr goes and steals his thunder. It was a real slap in the face, and the whole network was now worried, which was really bad for Ed's career. Would Ed get fired if this did not go to plan? Parr knew what he was doing, and he didn't even take it seriously. It was all a big joke to him. He introduced them by making fun of their hair and accents.
I know that England has finally risen to our cultural level.
Our boys are so much more than some novelty act, but this was day one of Beatles in America. It was like an alternate reality. And Ed wasn't going to let Parr make a mockery of his potential. So he got on the phone with Brian, ready to raise hell. I heard he even threatened to cancel the whole thing. But Brian was able to smooth things over. He was already the seasoned pro under 30 years old. He convinced Ed that his show would be different, that Ed would give the Beatles the respect that they deserved. So Ed finally calmed down and realized that Brian was right. He knew that his show was the one show that could really launch them into the stratosphere. In a way, Brian was fighting for the same thing Marcia had fought for in her letter. For the Beatles to be recognized as the groundbreaking artists that they were, not just a novelty act. Despite Jack Parr's attempts to steal the spotlight, the Beatles' Ed Sullivan performance went on as planned. But what made this broadcast so special that it became an unforgettable moment in television history? Well, when the Beatles finally did go on Ed Sullivan, it was like nothing anyone had ever experienced before. It was almost a feeling of danger watching them for the first time. I mean, sure, people had gotten a glimpse of them on Parr's show, but that was just a taster. When they did Ed Sullivan, that was a full meal deal. The production, the screaming fans, the millions of dollars it took for it to happen. It was a whole other level. It all began with Ed's simple introduction.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Beatles!
The Ed Sullivan Show was a big deal, but what was it really like? Soon we're going to hear from fans who saw history in the making and find out how four lads from Liverpool changed the world.
Close your eyes and I'll kiss you tomorrow.
As for the Beatles that night, they went with the flow, but boy oh boy, just like anybody would be, were they nervous. Stepping out there on that stage to the electric atmosphere, that multi-million-dollar stage lighting and the screaming crowds who had been waiting outside for hours must have been terrifying. They were suddenly worlds away from the days of playing in the cozy Cavern Club, but they knew the stakes. On reflecting on their big moment, they knew they couldn't mess this moment up, but they were born for it. They had their friends by their side who they grew up with, and they were still the four regular guys from Liverpool who had just found rock alchemy. They had suddenly found the exact combination that would change the world. Jack Parr may have tried to steal some of Ed's thunder, but in the end, it was Ed Sullivan who made television history that night. He's the one that truly introduced the Beatles to America. But for the people who were actually in the studio that night, it was like nothing they'd ever experienced before. The energy, the excitement, it was all electric. They watched four normal-looking lads transform before their very eyes. And to Paul, John, George, and Ringo, nothing was really too different. They wanted to give us all a good show and to feel the connection with the crowd. And the stories from that crowd are amazing.
Have you heard any reviews of your appearance last night?
The papers this morning just sort of... We only read 2 of them, and they weren't very favourable. I think one of the microphones was off, so that may...
The kids still liked it, you know.
Yeah, the audience was fantastic. Great reception.
Most of the audience, of course, were female and they were screaming at the top of their lungs. The Beatles gave their fans the chance to scream, to shout, to let their hair down and just go crazy. And it was pandemonium. But we found one fan, Patty Nazzaro, who was just 10 years old at the time, still to this day vividly remembering what it felt like to be in the middle of that Beatles-shaped storm. And for Marcia, watching at home, the energy must have been just as electric. She suddenly heard them coming from houses all around her, and she had believed in the Beatles from the very start, and now the whole world was seeing what she always knew. The Beatles didn't just captivate America with their music, they helped stir a change across the entire country. They were the symbol for difference and showed that by trying your best to stand out and deliver instead of just fitting in, big changes could really be made. You had the civil rights movement, you had the beginnings of the Vietnam protests, you had the women's liberation starting to bubble up, and of course the loss of JFK. And then you had these four lads who sang from their hearts, and they were like nothing else out there. Their music stirred something in people and made them realize that they didn't have to just sit back and take it anymore, that they could be anything they wanted to be. So on February 9th, 1964, the world held its breath as John, Paul, George, and Ringo took to the stage. The screams were deafening, the energy electric, and it was a moment that transcended music. It was a moment that defined an entire generation. The Beatles' appearance on Ed Sullivan was more than just a performance. It was a cultural earthquake. It ignited a passion for music, a sense of freedom, and a belief in the power of dreams. And it all started with a simple letter from a teenage girl who dared to believe. For Marcia, watching that performance must have been a surreal and proud moment. That band that she had championed, the band that she had fought to bring to America, was now captivating the entire nation. Her faith in them had been vindicated on the biggest stage possible. Now, of course, there have been many superstar performances on the Ed Sullivan Show, but never on the same scale as the Beatles. I mean, that was something truly out of this world. Were you one of the lucky ones to watch that show? What did that make you feel like when you saw it? Relive that moment with us and comment with us below. But there is still so much that happened the next day. But before we get to that, please like and subscribe for all of the amazing stories from rock history right here. It really helps. But back to the morning after the Ed Sullivan Show. And Ed commented on how he entered the hotel gift shop and saw empty shelves where the Beatles records had been. At that time, the Beatles records sold out faster than the stores could stock them. They were like gold dust, and the lucky few who managed to track one down were the envy of their neighbors. But before the Beatles went on that show, they had only one record that hadn't even cracked the top 100 in the States. But after that night, it was like a dam bursting. I Want to Hold Your Hand went to number 1. And then you had She Loves You at number 2. Please Please Me at number 3. I Saw Her Standing There at number 14. And the album Meet the Beatles debuted at number 1 and stayed there for 11 weeks. Imagine how Marcia must have felt, watching her favorite band climb the charts, knowing that her passion and dedication had played a part in their success. It was a testament to the power of one fan's love to change the course of music history. Capitol Records shared how they sold more Beatles records in the first 3 months of 1964 than they had sold by any other artist in all of 1963. In the first 4 months, the Beatles sold over 4 million albums and almost 7 million singles in the US alone. Also the next day, every British band worth their salt was trying to get a piece of the American pie. You had Dave Clark 5, The Animals, The Kinks, and Dusty Springfield all coming over and trying to make it. It was like the floodgates had suddenly opened. Everyone suddenly wanted to see what else this small, rainy country had up their sleeve. And that was what was amusingly dubbed as the British Invasion. And this cultural invasion wasn't just about the music, but it was the whole lifestyle. It was the attitude, the fashion, everything. Suddenly, every single kid in America wanted to grow their hair out, put on a Beatle boot and a mod suit, which is really amazing when you think about it. How one band, one performance really, could change so much. And that's what the Beatles did. They didn't just change music, they changed the whole decade. They changed the world up to today. And I remember Paul McCartney saying something about that years later, Something like, one of the nice things about the Sullivan Show was that it was a live show, it was real, and whatever happened, happened. And I think people like that. And it was just so different from what they were used to seeing. And he is so right. It was different, it was new and exciting and a little bit dangerous. And I think that's why it had such an impact. It wasn't just another band on another TV show, it was this moment. It was this moment that changed the world. Of course, nobody knew that at that time. Even the Beatles themselves had no idea how big it was going to be. They were just 4 kids from Liverpool doing what they loved, and that turned out to be the magic ingredient. The Beatles and Ed Sullivan was like lightning in a bottle, a perfect storm of talent and timing and just plain luck. And we're still feeling that aftershock even today, after all these decades later. It's funny. There was something about them, something so special, and you could just feel it even back then. It was like they had this alchemy about them, that magic. And it just exploded that night on Ed Sullivan. It went out over the airwaves and into millions of homes and hearts, and it really never went away. The Beatles, they were like this beacon that just kept on shining even after they were gone. So yeah, the fallout from that show was huge, bigger than what anybody could have ever predicted. And the records flying off the shelves, the British invasion, all of that. But really, it was just the beginning. That was just the beginning of something that would change music and culture and change the whole damn world. And at the start of it all was a 15-year-old girl who wanted to share this amazing hidden gem of a band with the whole of America. Over 60 years later, and the Beatlemania is still going strong. It's been one hell of a ride with huge highs and of course heartbreaking lows, but they were and still are undoubtedly the biggest band on the planet. And as for that performance on Ed Sullivan, it will be forever frozen in time. And watching that transports you back to the night that America met the Beatles for the first time and never looked back. And none of the entire story could have happened without a 15-year-old girl named Marsha Albert, whose love for the Beatles changed the course of music history. Like we talked about in our video about how Paul cried for John Lennon, it's all of these little stories and details that really paint a picture of how big of a deal this performance was, how much anticipation there was leading up to it. And then, bam, there they were, in just about every living room across America. It was like this shared experience that millions of people saw together, all at the same time. That is some powerful stuff. But for the Beatles, it was never about the fame, it was about the music. And George Harrison said it best himself.
I wanted to be successful, not famous.
All they knew was that they were just these 4 guys doing what they loved, and who wanted to share it with the world. And that's why everyone fell in love with them. They were musicians, artists, but maybe most importantly, great friends. And the impact of that is what is still felt in today's music. You can hear echoes of Beatles in just about everything that came after, but it's more than that. It's in the culture, it's in the way we think and feel about things. The Beatles, and that performance in particular, opened up a whole new world. It showed us that things could be different, could be exciting and new and a little bit wild. And in many ways, we've been chasing that feeling ever since. They made people like Marsha Albert not only believe in them as a band, but also believe in themselves too. So much so that they dared to do something about it. And it's those smallest actions in life that often lead to the biggest change. From a simple letter came a legendary show. And from that came music, hope, and a whole movement. Those 4 kids from Liverpool made magic that night. Magic that 6 decades later can still be felt in the air. There have been numerous music legends gracing our homes and our ears over the years, but none have ever hit quite as hard as the 4 lads from Liverpool who only ever set out to do just what they loved. The Beatles story is one of tough beginnings, unwavering passion, and the power of music to change lives. It's this story that Marsha Albert helped write, with a simple letter that changed the course of music history. Her faith in the Beatles helped pave the way for their enduring legacy. But what's your favorite Beatles moment of your life that you remember? Share it with us below. And thanks so much for watching, and enjoy these last interviews.
What do you think your music does for these people?
Well,
I don't know. It pleases them, I think. Well, it must do, because they're buying it.
Why does it excite them so much?
We don't know, really.
If we knew, we'd form another group and be managers.
What about all this talk that you represent some kind of social rebellion?
It's a dirty lie. It's a dirty lie.
What do you think of Beethoven?
Great, especially his poems.
Have you decided when you're going to retire?
Next week?
No.
No, we don't know.
We're going to keep going as long as we can.
When we get fed up with it, you know, we're still enjoying it, so...
Any minute now?